So, as a lot of you know, I've kind of been getting more into analytics as of late, but the reality is, I've always believed in analytics. It's just more so that I was actually more curious about a lot of this stuff and kind of said, why don't I just see what I can bring to the table and talk about analytics and, do some research on my own because there just isn't that much research out there. And so, I want to talk about one thing that I think is a big question among the football community where people will argue film versus analytics. And the reality is, the real answer is there should be a blend of both. And that's what that's the conclusion most people come to. But what I really want to talk about is when should you use analytics and when should you use film? Because there's times for both of them. And that's what I want to do. So, first, I kind of want to just real quick talk data versus logic. And data versus logic is a real thing just in life, let alone in football. But we're going to talk about it in the football context. And you might be wondering, well, aren't those two good things to use, using data or using logic? And yes, but no. So I think a lot of people typically only use data or logic. They don't use both. But really, there's time when you should use data and there's time when you should use logic. So let's take aliens, for example. That's right. We're talking about aliens. Trust me, I'm going somewhere with this. So if you ask me, do I believe in aliens? I'd say, yeah, there's probably aliens out there somewhere. Why do I feel that way? There is no data in this instance. And that's part of what I'm talking about. Typically, I want to use data first, but if there is no data, then you go over to logic. And logically, I would sit here and say, yeah, I mean, the universe is so vast, probably there's some aliens out there somewhere because there's no data. I can't prove one way or the other that aliens do or don't exist. Now, if all of a sudden data came out that showed that aliens don't exist, I would say, I guess I'm wrong. So logic is the second best way you can formulate an opinion, but the best way is using data. A good example of this, again, would be the flat earth theory that happened way back when, and still now, unfortunately, but back, we'll talk about it from the context of, back before they knew any better. There was logic behind the earth being flat, right? I mean, when you walk around, you just see flat stuff all around you. So, of course, thinking the earth is flat, there is some logic there. But when data came out proving that the earth is round, then most people said, oh, I guess it's round then. We'll believe that. So that's the data versus logic. And that's how I view basically every decision in football. Can I figure this out using data? If not, then I have to go over to logic. That's the way I want to do something. So, for example, which position groupings, matter the most, right? I've said on this channel a good amount that I think the offensive line is super important. But then I did this whole, project where I figured out what is more important, what isn't. And the data showed that the offensive line is still important, but receivers are more important. And to me, it's things like that analytics are good for. It's something like team building where you can definitively prove, or at least come pretty close to proving that makes more sense. Again, you can also use data and logic combined. You can look at the data and then sort of figure out why logically that would make sense as well. You can use them as a pairing, but the data should come first. And there's several things analytics are good for that you can prove. I mean, another good example of this, I would say, is in the NFL draft, figuring out which traits translate well to the NFL. And this is interesting because you have to use film to do this, because you have to watch film to figure out what traits these players have. But once you figure out the traits, you can use analytics and say, okay, a tackle with longer arms tends to be more successful in the NFL than a tackle with shorter arms. So that's what you should look at more and pay attention to. Look at his arm length because that matters. Whereas logically, you might say, who cares? He can get over. But no, there actually is logic or there is data to suggest that that is not the case. So this is actually what Billy Beane did in Moneyball. This is very similar to what he did. Obviously, in baseball, you have statistics you can look at, whereas football, it's just hard to look at those statistics given it's such a team sport. But in Moneyball, what Billy Beane did was he looked at players who were patient at the plate because those players were more likely to be good major league players than the ones who weren't. And he was right about that. So again, find the right trait. That is analytics. You have to use film on top of it, which is why, again, it has to be a blend. Another interesting thing you can use with analytics is probably the most common use of analytics. It's like situational football. For example, when should you go for two and when should you not go for two? When should you go for it on fourth down and when should you not? You can basically figure these things out, at least in terms of you can look at it and say, okay, on a neutral field with two teams that are equally good, basically you would have about this chance of winning if you do this and that chance of winning if you do that. Now, no game is played with neutral teams, so obviously you kind of have to use a little bit of logic there as well. But again, it's data, then using logic to make the end decision, which is good. You can also do it's good to quarterback sneak on a 4th and 1, so you can use analytics for that. Little things like that. That's something that Cleveland does stuff like that. Baltimore does stuff like that. It makes a lot of sense. Another thing that I want to do, this is my last point about analytics, is talking about what coverage to run. This is something that my next project, hopefully, will be this, at least one I want to do in the future. It would take a while, though, so I'm not sure exactly when I'll be able to accomplish this, hopefully at some point. But the which coverage to run would be a very interesting way to use analytics. Basically, just look at, 1,000 coverages over the course of a season and say, okay, teams were this successful running cover 2, this successful running cover 3, this successful running cover 4. Man coverage is actually better than zone coverage, that kind of stuff. Again, you can never just run one coverage, so you can't find the best coverage and then say, we're always doing that. But you could find the best couple of coverages and build your defense around that, which would, again, using analytics and then also using logic to figure out exactly when you want to do things. Because at the end of the day, even if, for example, if cover 3 was the best coverage, the reality is if teams know cover 3 is coming, they're going to be better at, attacking it. So you do have to mix things up. But that would be just an interesting way to sort of figure out maybe what your base coverage should be and then build off of that. So that's my last way I think that analytics could really help you. There may be some other things, but let's talk about now what film is good for, because film is also good for plenty. I mean, film is very important. And just because I'm an analytics guy does not mean I'm not a film guy. Obviously, you've seen how many I posted over 1,000 film studies. I pay a lot of attention to film, and I think it's really important. The best thing film is good for is talent evaluation. I don't really care about stats that much, which again, I think a lot of people might get a little bit confused by this because they think, okay, analytics guy, that probably means okay, you care about passing yards, but passing yards don't really matter. Well, no. To me, again, it's what does the data say? The data says that passing yards doesn't really equate to how good of a quarterback you are. It does a little, but it's not a great way. Whereas watching film, you can much more get a better understanding of who the player is. And you'll understand, if a player kind of has a down year, you watch the film and see, oh, okay, it wasn't really their fault, more of the receivers. You'll be better to predict that they're going to have a bounce back year than someone who doesn't watch the film and only looks at the numbers. So again, to me, this is where it gets a little bit tricky because analytics can kind of mean a bunch of different things to a bunch of different people. But that's what it means to me is kind of not just looking at numbers, but looking at the right numbers. Again, to bring up the Moneyball example, a big thing that they talked about was they didn't pay attention to errors. That's something that Bill James is big on. Fielding statistics drove him crazy because in fielding statistics, it's just some guy saying, I think that was a mistake, but it's hard to really quantify that. And so what they do is they actually watch film, which is kind of interesting. They create some sort of formula and watch the film and see, okay, does that qualify here or does it not? Which is, again, I find that very interesting. So it's not always about using numbers. It's about using the right numbers. And also, I think coaching evaluation is a big thing when you're watching film. Is, for example, like Dallas last year, you could just see these players never knew where to go. And that's big on coaching, in terms of their defense. Like same thing with the Raiders defense. They didn't know what to do. They'd play zone coverage and not know when they need to, move around. So stuff like that. You can blame coaching on it. You could also blame the players if you want to, but at least when you watch the film, you can make a judgment on that as opposed to just having to say, well, defense wasn't good, so that team must suck. Well, maybe not. Maybe it was a coaching issue. These are things that you can learn for film. There's a lot of good for film, and the reality is, I think that, again, much like the data versus logic, I would say that there is the analytics versus film. I would say see if you can prove something with analytics, but then if you can't, then I would use film to figure out the best way possible. Because film, it's not perfect science, right? And two people could watch the same play and come away with a different opinion, which is kind of one of the issues with film. But at the end of the day, it's still way better than not looking at it at all, because for talent evaluation, there's no better way to evaluate talent than to watch film. So yeah, just figured I'd make a video, kind of give you guys a little bit more insight into how I try to evaluate these things. Coming up, I'll be giving my preseason predictions. Kyle and I will be starting the it's going to be a 8 podcast series long thing where we did the same thing last year. We go through each division, do a deep dive, talk about all the little stuff involved, and I'll give my predictions at the end of those. So this is kind of how I come to conclusions just in general. And again, this isn't just good for sports. I think this is good if people viewed things this way. We have just better discourse in everything, let alone just sports. So it's that's kind of what I do. It's not exactly, again, I'm not like someone who's completely breaking new ground of this, but at the same time, a lot of people don't view things this way. So just letting you guys know how I view things. Hope you guys like this video. A little bit of a different one, but kind of fun, I think. And of course, as always, thanks for watching.